Welcome back to the final reflection in this little series on aging gracefully. So we've looked a bit about aging and demographics and some of the challenges that present to us individually and as a society. We've then looked in a little more depth about this whole issue of how do we, in general, and particularly in aging, interact with medical decisions and medical technology and medical possibilities. Now we're going to move a little more intentionally into the issue of dying. And it's clear to all of us that dying doesn't only belong to older people. In my career in pediatrics, I actually had a special interest in care of dying children. All of us have been touched by friends or relatives who were struck down by accident or cancer or some other diseases, 20s, 30s, early 50s. But what's clear about aging is that the end of your life is now in view in a way in which it wasn't before. So if we're to witness in some way to aging and to coming to the end of life in a more prophetic way to the world in which we find ourselves, then we do have some serious reflecting to do. I want to start this particular reflection with a scripture reflection, because we as Christian believers come to the question of death and dying and their related but distinct realities with a faith perspective. Faith doesn't take away grief. Faith doesn't take away fear or doubt or uncertainty, but it provides a context, and it provides a certain kind of consolation in establishing meaning and assurance for where things will end. So this reflection is actually from John, where Jesus is saying to us, just before his end, I go to prepare a place for you, so that where I am, you may be. He then goes on to talk about his Father's home, where there are many rooms for many people. So I think even in Scripture, we have this awareness about the uncertainty of where we'll be at the end. What kind of home will we be in? What will the end be as a place to be eternally? And we're really advantaged by having a faith perspective. But while we are on this earth, and particularly when we're in the process of dying, we've got some challenges that, in fact, need us to reflect more deeply. So the first thing I want to do in this session is just to identify clearly where people die and how people die basically in North America in the 21st century. What is dying like for most people? Then I want to reflect a bit on what we might mean by the Christian tradition of a good death. Of a good death. We actually say that. She had a good death. I remember using that expression in the secular medical school where I taught, and I had one of the senior residents say, Dr. Kenney, how can any death be good? Which shocked me, because our understanding that there is a reality of a good death, and of course even in the secular literature, There is a literature, there is evidence of what people, dying persons and their loved ones, believe is a good death. So let's reflect on that in general and in the Christian tradition. And then let's look at some of the questions that people are plagued by when they or their loved ones are dying. And we'll pay particular attention to the issue of pain control at end of life, feeding and nutrition when persons are dying, and then this whole problematic, very highlighted in North America today, of assisted death and the challenge that that presents to a Christian understanding. Because if we're going to model aging in a way that addresses issues, but addresses them in a way that is informed and yet peaceful, and that understands the meaning of death in a particular way, then we have to be open as well. So the first challenge before we look at where and how people die is for me to note the surprise that I have had as I've gotten older and my sister friends have gotten older and people I visit are older. I'm used to many people who are not religious not being able to talk about dying, not being able to talk about death. But I've been surprised that there are many religious who do believe that Jesus is preparing a way for us, who do believe that there is an afterlife and a home for us, who don't talk about it, who can't talk about it. Now, some of that is personality. Remember, in the session on decision making, we were very respectful for the fact that some people are big risk takers with medical decisions. Some people are very cautious and risk adverse. And to be respectful to those persons, their decisions have to reflect those differences. So some people talk about everything that's upsetting or frightening. Others keep everything in. The point I want to make is that for some of our reflection on witnessing care of the dying well, we have to be willing to open spaces and places and have a language for people to talk about their fears and to, in fact, begin to talk about their hopes and desires for their death and for the way in which they'd be cared for. Just because we're religious doesn't mean we can do that. So how do we die in North America today? Well, the reality is, in the Western world, North America par excellence, we are a death-denying, death-defying society. If we went to any hospital in any of the major cities near where any of you live, we would have today, in emergency departments, in intensive care units, in cancer units, huge big demands. More treatment, back to the OR, start an experimental treatment, do a fourth course of treatment, get in another expert. The world of modern medical science has done many, many amazing things in the last 30 to 40 years, including people dropping down with a heart attack being able to be brought back up again for a time, and maybe in reasonably good medical condition. But our belief has come to be, as technology's become so powerful in the imagination, that it can do everything. If you're fearful of dying for yourself, or more frequently, you are incapable of letting a loved one go, and you match that with a belief that there is a doctor with a hospital, with a technology somewhere that can stave off death, rescue you from death, then in fact the end of life becomes, and I've seen this so many times, this relentless pursuit of somebody somewhere. I can Google somebody somewhere who has a technology, a medication, and an intervention that will in fact prevent death from coming. So the world in which we find ourselves isn't one where death is understood to be a normal and natural part of living. Remember, I'm suggesting we understand aging, not as a disease, but as normal and natural. And the next natural phenomena is that dying itself, death, is a normal part of life. So the environment in which we find ourselves sometimes can be, in its relentless pursuit of some cure, it can in fact prevent the kind of reflection and careful attention to the beliefs and values of how a person accepting and facing inevitable dying and death might want to be treated. The next thing that is a reinforcement of what I've just said as a general death-denying, death-defying culture statement is in North America, 75% of people, I don't mean a sudden death, heart attack at home, 75% of people, elderly and ill, die in hospital. And most of them are still, remember the goals of care? To cure, to improve symptoms and to improve function, and to then care, accompaniment. Most of the people who die in hospital, who are most North Americans, are still relentlessly pursuing goals of cure. They're not even intentionally focused on goals of symptomatic improvement for those who are dying and can be helped. So, the 75% who die in hospital, the vast majority of them, we know it is a terminal condition. So, the issue that we're faced with then is what kind of places, what kind of other options might there be? And this is where, certainly in the developed world, the hospice and palliative care movements have come into play. These are ways of understanding the goals of medicine to comfort and to accompany, because medicine is used in hospice and palliative care, but it's used with goals of comfort so that people can in fact do their last things. So what we need to understand then is in our world, we have insufficient hospice palliative care facilities. Compared to hospitals and acute technology, we have an imbalance in the kind of support and the research into how to help people die in comfort and with pain and physical symptoms controlled. So that's the environment in which we then bring the characteristics and the tradition of a good death. Well, first let me tell you something that really astounded me, though it shouldn't have, in reviewing the literature on what ordinary people of faith, of no faith, against faith, how they describe, these are persons who are dying, but even more importantly, the loved ones, friends and family, intimate others, who've accompanied people who die. So just you think for a moment, what do you think might be the characteristics they'd name about a death? Now this would be people who are accompanying a loved one who has passed on. What would be the features that you think they might name to say, this was a good death? Nana had a good death. Uncle Charlie, he had a good death. As compared with, oh my, it was awful. It was just awful. It was awful. Well, in the general understanding, the first characteristic of a good death is non-abandonment and continuity of care. See, in the world of medicine and medical technology, no matter how well intended, when the focus is on the fix and the cure, and that's what makes you feel you're successful, there has been this terrible difficulty, one of the reasons for palliative care to develop, that once we recognize, medicine recognizes we can't cure and fix, the patient is abandoned. Language about, well, there's nothing more we can do. And language like that is even, there's nothing more we can do, now let's move to palliative care, which is wrong, wrong, wrong. once there's nothing more we can do for cure, there's a huge amount that we can do under the goals of palliative care for comfort, symptom control, and to assist persons in their last things, the farewell things that they want done in dying. So the characteristics that are generally understood then are non-abandonment and continuity of care, not 15 different specialists coming in and out for different aspects, which is what happens when it remains at a hospital acute phenomena and not an acknowledgement of dying. Second, the avoidance of unwanted technological interventions. In a sense, the whole ethics phenomena in modern time came about because people began to be fearful of tubes and technology intruding in their bodies, intruding in their relationships at end of life. But now you do realize, we actually have now the assumption in modern healthcare that if there's any machine, any drug, any device, that you're under an obligation to use it. You have to fight to refuse. And we should appreciate that in our tradition, where it's reasonable care, I talked about informed choice. Not informed consent. Informed choice consents to some interventions and it refuses others. But in our world, the good death, non-abandonment, continuity of care, avoidance of unwanted technology, respect, respect, respect. Respectful communication, attention to dignity of the person. And then finally, for everyone, of faith and not of faith, completion of what persons would call the last things. What was made popular by the movie, The Bucket List. And bucket list, not just in the sense of one more time I want to see a sunset on the desert, or I never did go on a balloon ride, but last things including, even in the general sense, I've never been reconciled with my brother. I never ever did tell my cousin how grateful I am for the help he gave me when I was in trouble. It's the last things. It's the communication. It's what I call the spiritual last things. So, if we're to model a good death, the Catholic understanding of a good death resonates with these general characteristics. And it resonates with the goals of palliative care. Shifting to the goals of palliative care, in fact, starting out with a palliative approach, which from the beginning of a diagnosis that's terminal or life-threatening, from the very beginning, there's a balance between cure, focus on cure early on in a disease, and focus on pain and symptom control, the management, the help with the management of the issue of treatment. If cure starts to get less and less likely, then more and more attention is given to the symptoms, to the emotional, spiritual issues of the patient. So the palliative approach, in fact, is one using the preventive idea we've discussed that gets you early on. All persons who are elderly need to begin to think now of the palliative approach to the end of their life. And the goals of palliative care are very clear. The goals of formal hospice and palliative care, so the shape it takes, particularly in the developed world, particularly across the United States and Canada. Hospice is more common in the United States. Palliative care units and community palliative care programs more common in Canada. But what they've all done, that is the key to something we need to model, they have all acknowledged that what is happening now is we're coming to the end of a life. Dying may not be imminent in hours or days or weeks, but dying is in fact closer than farther away. And the important thing here, as we now look at some specific questions that really haunt people in decision-making about end-of-life care, the purpose of medicine is very clear. It is to relieve pain and other physical symptoms, seizures, bleeding. Everybody talks about pain, and it can be problematic. I want now to make a clear distinction. Pain is a physical reality. It's in my bones. It's in my gut, my bowels. Pain is a physical reality. Seizures are a physical reality. Suffering is a human experience. It's a human experience of some kind of disintegration or stress of the soul. The whole person is. Now, illness and disease can bring suffering. But there are persons who suffer who have nothing wrong with them physically. Let me put it to you this way. If you have chest pain, I and my colleagues can do something for you. If you have heartache, I need to recognize it, but this now moves into the goals of palliative care that are spiritual, familial, emotional. This needs attention, but in our world, we want to medicalize suffering and treat it the same when it, in fact, is a much more complex human reality. So the goals of palliative care use medical science optimally. It isn't, we can't do anything more, let's use palliative care. We now use palliative care precisely to keep people comfortable enough so that they can receive the care, appreciate the care that's given them, say their farewells, give their forgivenesses, do whatever their last things are that would make their life complete. And palliative care also, the general movement, is very attentive to the spiritual, emotional, and familial goals that people have at end of life. So it's very compatible with our tradition. So, the Christian moral tradition, because I'm now going to talk about two areas that sometimes bother us. The Christian moral tradition will remember, since life and physical health are gifts of God, we have a duty to take reasonable care of them. But the other thing that we need to understand is that the Catholic Christian tradition does not see biological life as the ultimate good. We've had some folks who get themselves confused about this. Biological life is a penultimate. It's a next to the ultimate. The ultimate good is union with God. So in the Catholic tradition, and this is something I'm going to read, it's from Pope Benedict's message for the World Day of the Sick in February of 2008, but it's a beautiful description of the Catholic tradition. Human life, however, has intrinsic limitations, and sooner or later it ends in death. This is an experience to which each human being is called, and one for which he or she must be prepared. There's an end to it. It's not respectful of life to be constantly using medical technology to prolong biologic life when in fact dying is what's happening. This is where the media often gets this really wrong. They talk about life-saving technologies, and technology can be life-saving. But most often at end of life, this pursuit of when dying is what's clearly happening and people can't recognize it, it's not life-saving, it's death prolonging. And our tradition does not require that, absolutely not. In fact, in terms of refusal, again, this is John Paul II, now saint, to forego extraordinary or disproportionate means, to forego, no, is not the equivalent of suicide or euthanasia, which some people worry about. It rather expresses acceptance of the human condition in the face of death. So let's be clear, part of our modeling is use palliative medicine well, recognize that in fact recognizing and accepting death is in fact part of what we're asked to do in living life. Now, two big issues that bother people enormously. One is the issue of feeding when people are close to death. particularly when they become unconscious, and the other is pain control. So let's just kind of end this more medically oriented part of the reflection with being clear on this. We have an obligation to feed. I mean, feeding, it's a basic human condition. We feed babies. We have celebrations where we feed each other. You go back home after you've left for college and your mother, treating your 22-year-old, still makes everything that you've ever liked. Eat, eat, eat. Feeding is this huge connection. For Christians who believe in the Eucharist, it's the central reality of our faith. Feeding. So feeding has this, Scripture, if you can give just a little sip of cold water in my name. So this is this profound reality of feeding that is deeply important to us. Feeding is putting something in your mouth, food or drink. Medically assisted nutrition and hydration is not feeding. There was a whole problematic reflection a number of years ago on something that had been written from Rome, because it made it look or sound as if medically assisted IVs, nasogastric tubes, tubes that go through the abdominal wall, to continue medically feeding was the same thing as feeding. Those latter things are medical interventions. Now, in our day and age, they're done very frequently. Because something's frequent doesn't mean that it's morally obligatory. So let's recognize that when people see an older person who stopped eating, the first thing you do is you make sure they don't have a treatable minor condition that may be giving them distress. But for so many, it's the sign that the body is now acknowledging dying. You don't need calories when you're dying. The body literally begins to turn off as you die. And we need to have a different way of understanding for us to be concerned about the obligation when persons are clearly dying to do all these other medical interventions. It's quite frankly disrespectful of the integrity of the body as we die. Last medical issue, pain control. I grew up with an Irish mother, and it was very common. It will be common for many of you. When I complained, my mother said, you can all join in the chorus now, all of you who know this. Mother said, offer it up. Now, unless you're a Roman Catholic, you don't know what that means. But for any Roman, offer it up meant, wait a minute, Jesus suffered. You're supposed to join your suffering with that of Jesus. Offer it up. Offer it up. But for some who understand the passion, death, and resurrection, they can get confused. They can think that, in fact, they're obliged to have pain, including intractable pain or symptoms, as they come to the end of life. And this is not so. They are also very worried that using pain control methods speeds up death. For some, they even believe that the use of opioids in pain control is in fact euthanasia. Let's be really clear. The proper use of even opioids, and we use many more things in addition, the proper use, titrated use of opioids at end of life does not cause death. The evidence is clear that this does not happen when you're getting proper pain control. So the other reality for us is we know that if people are racked with physical symptoms, they can't do the spiritual end-of-life work. So let's be very clear that some of our concerns about don't give her that because you're going to cause her death, proper palliative care doesn't have that as a result. So, if we look at our tradition, and if we, in fact, kind of reflect on the kinds of things that we might manifest to our world, I think it's really important for us to appreciate that we can do a lot with pain and other physical symptoms. especially if we acknowledge that dying is what's happened. We don't go the route of continual decision-making as if cure were possible. That issues of feeding and issues of pain control are sensitive, but they can be dealt with well in our tradition and in modern healthcare. That pain and suffering are two different realities, that suffering requires the communal spiritual dimension of our response. But the world around us, in the movements towards euthanasia and assisted suicide, so you're very clear, have actually medicalized suffering. All of the literature worldwide on the reasons that people ask for assisted death, assisted suicide, or euthanasia, all of the literature is clear. It is extremely rare that it's because of pain, because we can in fact deal with pain. It's because of suffering. It's because of dependence, uncertainty, fear of the future, fear of abandonment and who will care for them. That's why the big public cases are always persons who have neurologic deteriorating diseases. These are tragic. Please understand, these are tragic and require a huge amount of support for individuals in their care. But they're not pain. They're not pain. So the issue for us is we need to witness to a way of dealing with pain and suffering that rejects the notion that we can medicalize suffering. Remember, you can be suffering and be perfectly healthy. And most people who suffer are. You can be dying and not suffering. So if we're to witness to aging and dying in a different way, I think there are some things we have to think about. I think as religious men and women, we have to be a little more attentive to, are we more reflective? Are we more intentionally focusing on understanding that in the Christian tradition, it is Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. It's the three that are connected, and we don't get resurrection until after death. That in somehow or other we have to model being attentive to, aware of, willing to identify with. Can we talk about these issues? And can we be advocates in our society for better care of the dying? More services, more research, particularly on those intractable issues of physical pain and other symptoms like shortness of breath. So, I think religious have this enormous opportunity to not only think more deeply about the aging process, but in aging, goals of medicine, and then the goals of medicine as we come to our end. What is a good death, and how do we retrieve and restore that in the world that is death-denying and death-defying? So the reflections for this final sober thought on dying and death are equally serious. So first I'm going to ask you to reflect on how deeply have you thought about your own dying and what in fact you think that might look like. I want you to reflect together with others on whether or not religious persons of committed faith are in fact more likely to reflect on these issues and to share them than others. And I want you to reflect on the notion that in fact some religious come to the end of their lives with unresolved pain, suffering, regret. And do we have ways to take that into account in trying to promote a good death? Then what do you think are our biggest obstacles to being witnesses to care for the elderly, particularly at end of life? And how well do we, in our own homes, hospice, palliative care, and long-term care homes, how well do we provide the possibilities, the environment that fosters the conditions for a good death?